So can I introduce you to, at the end is Magda Kopinska. She's the Director of Waterborne Transport of the European Commission. She's been in Brussels for the last 10 years, holding a series of top-level posts, and I'm utterly delighted to have her here on the panel. Thank you very much for coming, Magda. And I know your time is limited, so we're going to try and keep a tight session here to make sure it doesn't overrun. We've got Esbjørn Poulsen, another hugely well-known figure in the industry who needs little introduction from me. He is currently chairman of the International Chamber of Shipping and remains president of the Singapore Shipping Association. He's chairman of NSL, a container ship owning group, and a former chief executive of TORM Singapore. Panos Laskaridis is another one who needs very little introduction. He's been a ship owner for 35 years with famous names, Lavinia Laskaridis itself, with stakes in all sorts of shipping sectors. And he's just been elected as president of the European Shipowners Association. So I feel absolutely honored and delighted that he's here to make one of his first public comments since he took up the role, which actually begins in January, but he's clearly thinking ahead and thought out what he wants to do with it. On my right, we have Mario Mattioli. Great to have a Neapolitan sitting next door to me here and will be more well known to you. He's just been confirmed also as the new chairman of the Italian Shipowners Association, so we seem to have a lot of firsts here, and again, we're greatly honored and delighted that you can join us here this morning. Mario heads up a local family firm, Cafima, which operates a variety of vessels offshore and through a number of different subsidiaries. And last but not least, we've got Leo Drollas, who's one of the most world-respected energy economists. He's a former BP analyst, and he was a director of the Center for Global Energy Studies, which is a think tank set up by Sheikh Imani. And he's just reminded me that we first had a conversation about energy when I was the energy reporter on Lloyd's List, which is something like 36 years ago, which is deeply alarming, but also wonderful to know these friendships and contacts endure. So, as I said, we're going to have a look at China because it's like a hum when you're in London in the background. The sort of sound of the traffic is just there as a kind of buzz. You don't hear it like you're in the country and the car passes and it's just there. And the noise of China has been, as I said, in trade terms, very, very positive. This enormous economic growth, which has largely driven global economic growth and is still sort of powering along now. But the questions we want to look at are really the new power of China after the downturn. Has it been that state money in China is managing to project and build shipping entities, whether owning or yards, in a way that isn't done in the West? So I'm just going to ask these questions one by one. But before I do, Mr. Laskaridis has asked that he could make a comment, just a few short comments, given his newly elected position, and just to set a sort of very general shipping framework about policy issues that he deems important.
Thank you, Terry. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, welcome. I would like to thank the organizers for giving me the chance to speak for a few minutes. Thank you very much, Francesco. The triumphant music was a very good introduction to this panel. Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, as I came to the conference, I was preparing for a quite thunderous speech until I realized that in the panel with me are sitting my superiors, Mrs. Magda, who is of course our regulator, and Esbjørn, who is our our voice into the world, and the IMO most particular. So I will very briefly mention, by way of sort of bullet points, a few things which are at the top of the European, but some of them also at the top of the world agenda on shipping policy. I understand many of us, if not most of us, but certainly I am a ship owner and I represent a ship owning body, and this is the first comment I would like to make. I think we ship owners have to try and regain the initiative on the agenda of the shipping issues. And I'm saying this because in Europe and in the world, the stakeholders, be it politicians, be it regulators, being the European Parliament or other organizations, ministers and so on, when they speak about shipping, they mainly mean what we ship owners understand under the shipping cluster. And clearly there cannot be efficient transportation without a well-functioning cluster, but I don't particularly like thinking of us ship owners as just one more small link in the chain. I think we should try and think in terms of the ship owner and the ship owning business being the solid foundation upon which everything else is built up. Ship owning is the foundation, and then you get on top ports, terminals, logistics, and all the other services, and that will give you an efficient transportation service to the world and the world trade. The second point I would like to make is there are as many ships types in trading, and that means there are different types of ships businesses and ship trades. This sounds absolutely clear, but it will become perhaps a bit more important to consider this when we will speak in a minute, and hopefully also later, about the competitiveness of the European fleet and what that means for different ship sectors. So, these two introductory remarks. There are some other aspects I would like to mention. One is a problem which is troubling the shipping industry since quite some time, and which is the distinction between international and regional regulation. I don't need to tell you on which side the industry stands. We stand squarely on the side of internationally accepted regulation. Unfortunately, this is not happening in all aspects today. There are examples both in Europe but also on the other side of the Atlantic where local governments and local interests produce regional legislation, and only after the event and after we have seen the bad effects of these regional regulations, we try to find international solutions. You are very familiar with some of the examples that we all deal with every day. In Europe, we have the case of the MRV system. We have the case of the ship recycling regulations, both cases where the industry stands and wishes to have international solutions, whilst Europe has a different view and has introduced or is about to introduce different regional regulations. On the United States, of course, the most classical example is the ballast water management system. Again, a messy affair about something that ought to be quite clear-cut and where the world should have found a common approach and a common position. Now, for us in Europe, we have, of course, our authorities with whom we have to deal, and principally the guidelines of the European policy are coming from the Commission, and we have an eminent representative of the Commission here today. I would like to very briefly mention the main points of the European policy as it was proclaimed 2 years ago by Commissioner Violeta Bulc, and quickly to remind ourselves, this was climate change or decarbonization, or however one wants to call it. Second, it was the social agenda. Thirdly, it was the competitiveness of the European flag. Fourth, and it was the access to foreign markets. And the last one was digitalization, but in combination with the streamlining and making more efficient the procedures in intra-European trading, documentation, and regulation, what we sometimes call under the more general name of the single European window. These five elements have been going on for quite some time. There have been slight amendments and progress has been made on these issues up until this spring, when the Commissioner has called for a brainstorming session in Florence, and several people from the European shipping industry of various sectors have participated, and the idea was, and we have tried to think about the changes in shipping that are likely to happen over the next 20 to 30 years. Many of the considerations were similar to the 5 points package I've mentioned before, but some others have emerged, and some have emerged with different weighing, different weight of consideration. For example, digitalization has come up very strongly. A lot is being talked about it. Digitalization, of course, comes with all sorts of other salt and pepper issues, like the disruption. Disruption, as you know, is a very fashionable discussion today. So, China and the relations with China, and especially how to meet China's aggressive proceedings in Europe, where they're buying up ports and other facilities. This will be a subject of the discussion today. So, generally, and just not to speak for far too long, there are issues on which everybody has its own views, everybody has his own way of thinking that he will try to save the world, especially on the climate debate, and I'm sure this will come out in a minute. But generally speaking, the time has come for all participants in the shipping industry to get together, talk to each other, try to find ways, bold ways of proceeding into the future in a mutually cooperative and efficient way, concentrating on what is really important and leaving the other discussions aside. Well, thank you very much, and Mr. Chairman, this is all I propose to say, and I will be happy to take any questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. Mario, I feel kind of duty-bound, having listened to the European ship owners, to offer you an opportunity to say a very, very few words, if you wouldn't mind, about the priorities for Italian shipping. If you could be brief, I'd be most grateful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this opportunity. This is the 8th edition of this interesting seminar that Francesco is organizing, and I'm honored to be here this year as the newly elected chairman of the Confitarma, the Italian Shipowner Association. Yesterday we had our election in Rome, and I had a lot of interviews, as you can easily imagine. So today on the press there is quite a lot of which are the priorities, and I will not be really boring you about that. But mainly I think that it is important to say that we will be working very hard in order to keep the regulation of what is called the international register and the tonnage tax that we have in Italy, that, as you know, and that has been clearly explained by Panos, it is a very important tool that is able to keep the European flag vessel competitive with the other flags. So it's something that comes from Europe, is done basically in all the other European country, and it is the first priority that we have to keep that register still going on for the future, for the competitiveness of our fleet. And this implies a lot of other things. We'll be working very much mainly on the training. I think the human capital is crucial nowadays on board of ships, more and more than it was in the past. So we'll be having a lot of efforts about that, as well as anything that is connected to the climate change and what will be asked to do to us as a ship owner to participate in order to create and to, let's say, grant a better world to the future generation. I think these are the main topics. Then there are some gossips, but you will be reading on the press, and I will be not boring you about that. thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, Mario. So we're going to go on to this, back to the sort of main themes that I outlined before. In particular, we're going to start with China. Panos has kind of hinted at some of the issues involved, and events like the Costco $6 billion takeover of OOCL, that would have seemed extraordinary certainly 10 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, but it's certainly part of a sort of this growing boom which has seen not just owners, also yards and ports around Europe, Athens and in Italy, being bought by China. And I'm interested in what we all think really about whether this is a force for good, whether this is a huge free trade opportunity, whether this is anyone who's got money has got to be welcome, or whether there's a slight unease about this state-backed, what could be seen as a threat of Chinese money. So how do you feel? Leo, it's perhaps slightly unfair because you're looking at it as an energy man, but certainly part of the drive trade-wise has been through China becoming the biggest oil importer in the world. And so it has had a huge implication in that respect. What do you think? I mean, you're sort of slightly standing aside about this, whether China is a force for good or, in industrial terms, quite a complex situation.
Well, China, as everyone knows, is one of the great nations, was in the past, and is certainly one of the most important ones, and a fast-growing economy. They, of course, in shipping terms, they had many centuries ago a blue water fleet. They roamed around the Indian Ocean, and they were traders then, of course, and then they went back into their shell, so to speak, for many centuries, and now they're coming out again and connecting with the world, if you like. They are the workshop of the world, as Great Britain was in the 18th century to the 19th, then taken over by the United States as the workshop of the world, and now China is. And the big question, of course, is how long will they continue to dominate the world economy? They are the second largest, and some say that very soon they will be the largest economy in the world. I'm a little bit skeptical about how China will continue to grow, or whether it will at these rates. Some economists are not believers in these great growth rates of 6%, 7% that the Chinese themselves put out. There are certain technical reasons why one should doubt these high growth rates that they tell us that they are generating. They're also getting old. Their demographics are not very favorable. Of course, they had the one-child policy, which they've now abandoned, realizing that not having many children doesn't help for the future. So China, the big question with China has been embedded in the phrase, China will probably get old before it gets rich. And this, I'm not so sure that this might happen, but it's certainly a big issue for China. And then, of course, we have the whole system of the banking, the shadow banking system, how they've used their vast wealth that they've created, whether they've used it wisely. And now, of course, they are buying into the rest of the world, which is what you suggested earlier, a trend. So China is a big, important country, and climate change is, of course, one of the issues regarding China, which we should really examine. On the one hand, they have accepted their role in the Paris Treaty, but on the other hand, they are building, I can't remember the exact figure, but one coal-fired power station every week. So China is saying one thing and doing something else. They have, of course, a huge pollution issue. And I think the main driver for change and China espousing climate change policies is the fact that they have very heavy pollution in the large cities. And perhaps they're not thinking so much of climate change, but actually just reducing the heavy pollution. So these are some thoughts I have on what you said.
Very interesting too. Mario, can we go to sort of right to the nub of this? What do you think about, is Chinese investment welcome in Italy, or is it something to be slightly wary of?
It's something to think about, because for sure China at the moment is the country that has put a huge amount of money in plants. Whether they will be they will come out really is something to look at, but definitely, I mean, I was recently reading about the One Belt, One Road project and the Silky Way project. That the amount of investment for the next 10 years is something like 12 times the actual values that would have had the Marshall Plan, that in our mind is the most extraordinary investment. So of course it is challenging, it is scaring as well at the same time. So I think that in Italy, the Italian way should be the one to look at it at the moment as a big opportunity, because especially when we look at the way of One Belt, One Road, basically Italy is the ending part of this belt. And being the ending part of the belt, it could be an inversion of the tendency that we have now, because Italy has a geographical position for which is considered to be a sort of logistic platform within Mediterranean. But if you then look at the traffics and to what comes to Italy, most of it comes from the north of Europe. So all our big industries in the north, they import goods that comes from Germany, that comes from Netherlands, and so on. So I think that if we look at it as an opportunity, it could inverse the trend, and eventually Italy could become the arrival point of the goods that then go up eventually to the north as well. We need to make some changes, because Italy is, I'm an Italian, and Italy is a strange country to a certain extent. We have a lot of good thoughts, but sometimes a little bit of difficulty in putting it in place. And so sometimes we are overcome by the events that happen in the real world, and we always are on the backside. I mean, so I think that the most important thing in Italy could be, in order to get the possibility to use in the best way for Italy, so to improve the occupation and so on, would be really to create a political consensus on the sea. And when I say sea, I'm not just talking about the shipowners. Shipowners is, as Panos was saying, a very important part of the chain, but it is a part of the chain. The other part of the chain that is crucial is all the infrastructure, all the regulation within the ports, and all the infrastructure that has to be built. So I think that if in Italy the dream that we have is to go back not to the Ministry of the Merchant Marine, but to have a sort of Ministry of the Sea, intending the sea and as something that is really affecting the whole cluster of the ship, meaning logistic, meaning infrastructure, meaning all the, so to have a big attention on that. And at the same time, it is also important for Italy, in order to get to that, to reduce bureaucracy, because bureaucracy is another terrible point that is affecting a lot the daily life of everyone who is acting in Italy. And really, these two things would really mean that Italy is going to make the necessary step ahead in order to be more European and less, if you like, Mediterranean or Latin, but in the old sense.
Okay, interesting. Panos, do you want to just make a quick comment about China? Frightening or scary, as Maria used that word, or a massive opportunity?
I think it's really what you make out of it. If you just sit back and watch them come invade Europe and buy everything up, and you think this is what is happening, then of course this is a threat. If you look at it as an opportunity to work with them and through them in promoting one's own interest, then of course this is a tremendous opportunity. I think what we can surely say is that the Chinese mean what they are about to do. You know, this famous One Road, One Belt concept. I used to think for a long time that this was just a play and a political statement, basically, until I found out that the Chinese are lending huge amounts of money to repair and refurbish and upgrade the rail system in Serbia. Now, you may ask yourself, what on earth do the Chinese want to do with upgrading the rail system in Serbia? So it turns out they've bought the port of Piraeus. Now the weak link to bringing the products to Europe is the railway. Serbian railways are in a mess. Ours are not far behind. So now they want to turn their attention to this thing. That's observation number one. Observation number two is that this one road, one belt has for them more importance and more political clout in terms of the land route rather than the sea route. And they are, and we know this, they are investing a lot of money and a lot of effort lending monies to the different Central Asian republics to issue their own debt and their own bonds in order to also undertake a whole series of infrastructure projects. So, yes, they are for real. On the other side, on the European side, there is a big worry, and the Commissioner and we have debated this last time in Florence. We want to have easier access to China, which is today almost non-existent, in reciprocation for their easy access to investments in Europe. So why can they buy a port or a terminal in Europe and we can't buy a terminal in Shanghai or Shenzhen, which is, as you know, right today is impossible. Finally, on the pure shipping side, on the pure ship owner side, 10 years ago, there was a big discussion that China is going to overtake in very few years both Japan as their next biggest ship-owning nation, and of course Greece, which was and still is the biggest one. And 10 years later, despite the huge growth and the huge rising of the Chinese economy, we have the following very interesting point. In pure shipping terms, in pure capacity shipping terms of international trade, the distance between Greece and China has widened in the last 10 years. It has not shrunk, so the difference now is bigger than it was 10 years later. Why is that? Because the Chinese have also found out that you cannot learn and do in 10 years what others took 2,500 years to learn.
Thank you.
So we are quite happy with this position.
Okay, thank you. Esben, what's your view about this?
I think I always go back to Napoleon's words in the late 1700s, beware the sleeping giant, for when it awakes, it will shake the world. And I think we've seen this. I've worked and lived in Asia for nearly 40 years, and I first arrived in Hong Kong 4 years after the end of the Cultural Revolution. And so I have really seen this change up close. In those days, China were buying ships using the Somali flag, if you can believe it, through single-purpose companies, because Chinese flag vessels couldn't call in many ports, like in the United States, as one example. So the progress from then till now, I think it's there for all to see. I think we're all well aware of it. But specifically, some of the points raised, I agree with Panos that how to manage these things is the key, because the Chinese are there, they're going to do it, and they are capable of doing it, and they will do it, I have absolutely no doubt. But it's a question of whether you can manage it in a way that's beneficial to each side, so that it becomes good business for them and for their opposite number. And I think I am very, very optimistic, and I think One Belt, One Road certainly has a political dimension to it, there's no doubt about that. But I've seen documentaries on the impact it's already having, as you say, on the land-based side of the rail and so on. It's incredible what's already happened in this project. And in Europe, until very recently, you didn't hear that much about One Belt, One Road. But living in Asia, we hear a lot about it, because it's spin-off, be it finance, be it construction companies and so on, that are going to get involved and benefit from it, of course, is tremendous. So this will have an impact, and it will certainly, on a more narrow basis for the shipping markets, be great for the, indirectly be great for the bulk market and other segments of the industry. So I'm very bullish about China. I accept that the figures, as has been pointed out, are not always what they may seem, but I think I would never bet against them.
Can I just ask you, I mean, you talk about how to manage it. What are you looking for there? I mean, would you like some kind of policy intervention or governmental discussion around this, or is this on an industry-to-industry basis?
I would say it's on an industry basis. I think once you start, I mean, the Chinese are very committed to the WTO. They're members of the WTO, and some would say that they don't always respect the spirit and the detail of the rules, but nonetheless, they are an active subscriber to WTO and those principles that it involves. So I think it should be industry to industry more than governmental. Yeah.
So would you like some kind of maritime body, perhaps, to take it upon itself to have some kind of bilateral, not legally enforceable, but at least in the first instance, some kind of conversation about where we are with this and whether everyone's getting reciprocal treatment, or this is a bit of a one-sided relationship?
No, I mean, I think at various levels, I mean, for example, very recently, Hong Kong Shipowners Association, I happen to know, had a high-level delegation go to Beijing and engaged at various levels, up to including a very high level. And this is an ongoing thing, and it's a dialogue thing, and you know, they are members of the Labour Affairs Committee of the International Chamber of Shipping, and we're discussing with them and hoping to get them to join as full members, because we really would like them involved given their size and importance. Right. But I think it is very much a dialogue thing. In Singapore, we've also had delegations go up. We've had visits from them, and so it's you know, it's an ongoing dialogue. I mean, there is this thing that you know, there are quite a lot of private owners developing in China now. Everybody thinks that it's just Costco and related, but actually there are numerous provincial and other private owners in China that you never hear much about, but which are becoming quite substantial businesses in their own right, establishing offshore companies in Hong Kong.
Okay, thank you. Magda, I mean, there's various issues being raised here around...
I have a long list of comments.
You've got a long list. Well, I think you should be allowed to run through your long list. I'm very mindful that I've got a big monitor here that says 25 minutes and 28 seconds, so we're going to have to kind of really fast forward some of the other questions and sort of zoom through climate change and things. But take your time, because a lot of questions have been raised that directly involve you. I'd be very interested in your response.
Thank you very much. But before I do, can I just thank Francesco for having invited me to be here. It's the first time I'm attending your annual meeting. It's quite spectacular, I have to say, and I don't mean just the location, which speaks for itself. I would also like to apologize to everybody that immediately after this panel I will need to run. That's been a complicated week of traveling, and I do avoid doing those things. But the deal was either I come and I'm here for the panel, or I don't come at all. And having listened to all the interventions, I don't regret being here. And I would like, Terry, to congratulate you on the last question that you put to Esben, because you've just turned my pre-prepared reply upside down when you ask whether it should be industry to industry or whether it should have some sort of government, regulatory, administration involvement when we talk about China. But I would like to start with something else. If you listen to the latest State of the Union by President Juncker, and I think you should, at least for the reason that it was full of references to the maritime world, and the whole line was around setting a positive course for the ship that is called European Union, you would have noticed undoubtedly that much more than in the previous years, the question of a positive and rather offensive trade agenda for the EU was at the center of his speech. And a clear acknowledgement that we need to take defending European interests in the global world even more seriously than so far. A number of regions were mentioned that will be crucial in terms of future free trade agreement, but in many elements of the speech, you would guess that China was somewhere at the background. And one specific issue where I'm pretty sure China was at the center of the comment was this question of looking more closely at third country investment in Europe and looking at the question of reciprocity. And that's exactly what Panos was referring to, that we have to be more attentive when we see third countries coming into any of the EU member states to make sure that we can get a fair and similar deal when European companies go and want to invest in those countries. It will not be easy, and nobody in this room will believe that discussing things with China is straightforward. Esben is extremely optimistic about involving China in a discussion, but I think we have had the experience of an EU-China maritime dialogue that has been going on for 12 years now. It's a bit of a unique creation because it's a set of meetings where you have European Commission, but also you have EU member states in the room, and you have European industry. EXA is always present at this meeting together with national ship owners. And it's interesting to see how over the 12 years this dialogue changed. I wasn't there when it was started, but I have watched it for the last couple of years, and I clearly see a growing importance attached by the Chinese side to the maritime dimension. At the beginning, it was quite low profile, also in terms of the administration coming from China, also in terms of the power of statement that the head of Chinese delegation would be making. It has changed over the years, and it has changed for the better. They clearly recognize maritime as an important offensive power in the overall China economy, which on the one hand makes discussions easier because you really have people with authority on the other side of the table. On the other hand, it of course makes things more difficult because the same people with authority, they realize how much value there is in making Chinese maritime power more effective. And if I'm not mistaken, recently the One Belt, One Road initiative has been also labeled One Belt, One Road, is it One Circle? To clearly add the maritime dimension into that, because so far One Belt, One Road was really focused on the land-based. We have been, on the part of the Commission, we've been engaging with China through something that we called connectivity platform. Again, looking at this land-based investment side, where a requirement that the Chinese side agreed to has been that whatever investments are made with regards to infrastructure, for example in rail, either in EU countries but also in Western Balkans, now that we have an EU-Western Balkans Transport Treaty signed, that all those investments will be done with full transparency, open access, in a way that any company that wants to be part of that investment plan can join. But it is a set of continuous discussions to make sure that we understand how to deal with investment, that the understanding is similar on both sides. So I don't think anybody on the side of the European Commission has any doubt that China is being taken seriously by us, but I will here disagree with Espen, because I think leaving discussions only to the industry will not necessarily always be enough. And it is not to say that industry always needs to look to the regulators, but coming back to the free trade issues, the power of negotiating on behalf of EU 28 or 27, if that's what happens, is still bigger than the power of negotiating on behalf of every single individual member state. And I know this is not a view that everybody shares, and I know that nowadays it's not very popular maybe to talk about the power of EU as a group of member states, but I still think, looking at some of the free trade agreements that we concluded, where we included the maritime transport part, it does allow for better position for European industries. And maybe just to finish off my too long comment, again on China, the maritime dialogue with China is quite interesting, because you sit in the room, you state what you want to state, and then you never know if it works or if it doesn't, but sometimes it does, and sometimes actually we have had a few cases already over the last couple of years where, as a result of that discussion, where again it's the European Commission and member states sitting together with the industry behind us, where we managed to make Chinese government reconsider or slightly alter what they wanted to do. It is not a big scale change, but it is one little issue here and one little issue there, and I think this is the best way to approach China.
So if there was an example of a major investment now being made in a very large European port, one of the key ports, Hamburg, Rotterdam, London or whatever, would you see that as an opportunity to intervene and say, this is a very exciting development, but we need to set some ground rules here, because there's been this kind of creep where we haven't up till now, we've just accepted the presumption of good, but we also want to challenge this formally because of the lack of reciprocity, the difficulty of getting into Chinese markets. Is that a chance that could happen?
Before the panel, Terry told me that I can always decline a comment if I don't feel comfortable. No, I'd say we would certainly discuss with the port authorities and national governments issues to draw their attention to, but this is not for the European Commission to sign off or not sign off individual investments. But I think having a dialogue and making sure that we all understand what are the rules that need to be put in place for such investment, that will certainly do.
Right. And I presume our ship-owning community would be very happy if the Commission stayed out of things, or not?
Well, let the community speak. It depends on what the position of the Commission is. If it is in our favor, they're most welcome. If they're not in our favor, then obviously there's a problem. But, jokes apart, the issues today are so large, so important, so international, that I think that one side needs the other. The Commission cannot just go forward and regulate and legislate in a vacuum. Neither can the industry go ahead and trying to think that we live in an area which was 13, 14, 50 years ago when there was no regulation. I think both sides must balance and find a common way of going ahead. We must understand that we live in a world where regulation is there and is there to stay, but the regulators must also understand that they are around for 30 years, but we have been around for 30 centuries. So we must find the proper equilibrium and the proper balance of cooperation.
Okay, thank you very much. This monitor in front of me is telling me that I've got 14 minutes and 38 seconds. Is that the right deadline that we're working to?
I think you will have an extra time, but we have to close. What time is it now?
It is 11:45, so we have actually 40 minutes.
So, yes, I think we have some video that you want to...
We've got 40 minutes.
Yes. We have got 40 minutes to let Magda have a coffee
Okay.
before her car, and also we will need a coffee.
Okay, can someone change the monitor, because it's extremely useful to have that.
Yeah, okay, I'm sure Manfred.
If we could make it for we're going on till 11:30, is that everybody's agreement here? Well, that's...
Don't worry about the monitor, we're in Italy here.
So we call this...
11:30, I just stand up and leave.
Yes.
It's not baseball time, it's football with some...
Okay, I like it. Okay,
So
we've still got 35 minutes. Because of that, I'd like to ask this question of Brussels. Should the Commission, can it or should it do anything to ensure that Europe retains a significant critical mass of local ship owners and shipyards? Should governments be involved in helping, whether it's framing regulation or otherwise? Do we care if European nation states, their shipbuilding and their ship owning is decimated by competition? Is there a point at which we need to have some kind of critical mass? Can I ask you, Magda, first, and then the owners will say their piece?
I actually just wanted to exactly ask for that I can be the first one, and then I'll be open to whatever comes from the distinguished panel, if you allow me to respond at the end, obviously. But joking apart, to comment on what panel said, I think I very much appreciate that statement, especially from the next president of EXA, that we both need each other, the regulators in the industry, and I very much hope that there is a recognition that we have been working differently in terms of taking into account and listening to the statements and concerns and views of the industry. In our case, shipping industry, but I think across the entire way, how the European Commission does policy today, it has changed a lot. What I need to say, and this is not throwing the blame on others, but let's not forget that we put the proposal on the table. We don't influence the final shape of the proposal. The final shape of the proposal is done by national governments and European Parliament. And on many instances, it alters, it's different to a great extent from what we proposed originally, sometimes for the better, that I have to acknowledge, and sometimes not necessarily so. To answer your question, I think it's worth recalling that shipping is the only sector in the EU that has a special state aid regime in place. No other sector has something like a tonnage tax where a favorable, okay, I take the word favorable back, where a different way of treating the economic outputs from that sector is in place, and the whole idea of putting the tonnage tax into life was exactly to make sure that for this very unique sector where outflagging is almost the easiest thing you can do in the world, well, we could prevent it, and we could try to keep as much EU flags as possible. A couple of years ago, we launched an overview of the sector, and it was interesting to see that while at the beginning when the tonnage tax was introduced, it had a highly positive influence on ships staying under EU flag, but after this growing number, at some point it stagnated. And I remember at that time I did ask a question to EXA, so what is it that we could do more? What is it, can it actually change? Can we get even more European flags? And the answer is not easy, and I know the answer is not easy for ship owners, so it's even more difficult for us. But the very fact that this tonnage tax system exists is I believe, a clear indication that yes, we want to see as many European flags as possible.
Okay. Esbjørn, do you have a view on that?
Well, I think I have to defer more to the European view because it's a more of a European question. But I think it may be true that the number of ships entering European flag under tonnage tax has flattened out a bit. But there's no question in my mind that without it, if you go back in time, the exodus of European ships from European flags would have been far, far greater without tonnage tax, because the tonnage tax has established. I'm very reluctant to use the word level playing field because it's the most overused expression on earth, but especially when it comes to shipping. But it is, I think, important to point out that shipping is a global business and ship owners are free to move. It's a very, very free business, and ship owners can decamp and go elsewhere if they're unhappy with the scheme that they have. So I think actually in that context, the tonnage tax system throughout Europe has largely been successful.
Right. Panos.
Yes. Thank you. Magda has put the framework in a very diplomatic and circumspect way, I think the situation is quite easy. The state aid guidelines have been in place for a very, very long time, and they've been extremely material in maintaining a big, strong, and powerful European fleet. No question about this. The reason why recently it appears that the European flags are somewhat slowing is simply that other centers have been growing very much more aggressively. We have realized that at Exxon we have commissioned last year a big study which was conducted and which has in the meantime been ready and has been presented also to the Commission, which has compared the situation in Europe with five foreign, in terms of the European context, shipping centers, which was Vancouver, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Shanghai. And the very short outcome of the study was Europe is more or less in a fine shape, but the study has identified a few problems which diplomatically are called gaps in policy, not only in the tax issues. Well, tax issues are very important, perhaps the most important, but also the study has looked at regulatory environment, human resources area, and some others. And what has transpired from this is that Europe must continue and must improve its conditions, and that refers especially to the state aid guidelines, which of course is not something for the Department of Magda, but it's the...
That's Commission, that's okay.
Yeah, it's generally the Commission's responsibility in order to keep the European fleets at bay. Now, as Espen said, it is very easy for the vast majority of the European fleets, which are the cross-traders, the Trump kind of owners, such as usually Greeks, Cypriots, Italians, Germans, are mostly cross-traders. It is very important to keep a big and substantial fleet. The matter of the fleet being efficient and being competitive is very important, and therefore we are looking at this. But there is a very broader strategic issue here. And I think because we Europeans like to little bit fight between ourselves, if you go to the United States or to Canada, you will find out that they have a big appreciation of Europe having this very large, transparent, efficient fleet of cross-trading Trump ship owners. Why? Simply because they realize that they don't want to wake up one day and find their products being carried by ships which have been built, which are operated, which are owned, which are manned by their main commercial competitors. So they don't want to see their cargoes being carried by only Chinese, Japanese, or others who are competing with them in every side of the business. And they very much appreciate this European fleet being there and being efficient, being strong. And we must be very careful to maintain this fleet if we don't want to see what has happened to the shipbuilding industry, which has wholesale moved to the Far East, and now in Europe we are only building cruise ships and big yachts. So we all have to be very careful about this.
Okay, thank you, Panos. Mario, do you wish to make any comments about that?
Yeah.
You already talked about the importance,
Yes.
continuing
Yeah.
importance of the tonnage tax in Italy.
Not only in Italy, yes. I think is crucial to keep this plant also because I mean, as has been clearly stated, I mean the shipping is movable everywhere, and the main issue of the tonnage tax was not only to keep within Europe the flag, but everything that is connected to the flag, meaning occupation, meaning seafarers, meaning everything that is connected to the shipping industry in terms of ancillary works to the shipping insurance rather than P&I clubs and so on. So the finance is one of the main issues as well. I mean, everybody knows that London has been always considered let's say the princess square of shipping. So I think that overall, if we leave the possibility to keep an advantage for this sector that is not an advantage in itself, but is something that is giving the opportunity to be in competition with other flags. So, I mean, it's not an advantage compared to the other industry. It is the only way for which shipping companies can survive to the competition of. So this is must be extremely clear, because otherwise it becomes a big mess. So this is the point. So I think it's crucial to that and to keep these. Then regarding the lower increase that has been seen, first of all, I mean, is 10 years about that we are in a deep crisis. So overall, I mean, for probably investments has gone down, and at the same time, I think that one other issue that we have to look at is how Europe should modernize in terms of training and rendering this kind of business more attractive, and attractive at least as it is in other countries, because nowadays, I mean, especially in Italy, but in all Europe, we will have a lack of officers on board of our ships, and of course the request is there, owners are there in order to employ, but at the same time we have a shortage of seafarers. And so I think that one of the main problems is also to adapt the teaching and the training schemes to what is really the life. And then last but not least, probably Europe should be more Europe than aggregation of different countries, and this is an aim that we have, because most of the time we have to accept what is said in Brussels, translated into the legislation of the various state members, and most of the time, at least in Italy, we are very late in having to do things that in Europe have been decided 3-4 years ago. I mean, sometimes we have to rush in order to apply because there is a deadline. So from this point of view, I think that we should be more united as Europe rather than a concentration of different countries, and I think that this would be terribly helpful.
Okay, thank you very much, Mario. And I suppose we'll get on to a general debate about European integration, or we'll be here next week. Now, I want to move on to the climate change issue, but Leo, did you want to make a quick intervention?
I just wanted to tell us a very quick cautionary tale that the British shipping industry in the 19th century was supreme. Across the world. It carried, I think, in the late 19th century, around 80% of world trade was carried in British vessels. And the demise of that great industry took a long time, but it was not helped by taxation on the one hand and unionization on the other. Now things are as they are, and the British fleet is much reduced. And it's a cautionary tale, so it's one the Commission, I think, should listen to more carefully. And in view of Brexit, there is a chance for British industry, the shipping industry, to revive itself, especially if taxation could be reduced, and we're not subject to the attempt by the EU to have a common tax despite Ireland's objections to have a common tax rate. So this is a cautionary tale, and I think the EU and the European shipping nations, like of course Italy and Greece, should be careful about, and not to get carried away with this common approach. Thank you.
Well, I think it's probably when British vessels had 80% of the world's trade, it was probably when they were running a massive empire, and I think only Boris Johnson and maybe Liam Fox believe that Brexit will produce another British empire. So we'll move on to climate change. Baroness Bryony Worthington, unfortunately, can't get here in time to give the presentation herself. She'll be here later on, which is unfortunate. But she has sent an audio tape, and so we'll hear this disembodied voice, which is just really a very, very brief introduction by Bryony on climate change and shipping. And why should we listen to a member of the House of Lords? Because she wrote the UK Climate Act, and she's been very instrumental in driving the climate agenda in the UK and more widely. So I don't know whether we can miraculously hear the audio tape. Well, we've got a picture of Ryan.
Terry, for inviting me to this conference. I'm delighted to be addressing you. Sorry that I'm not there in person, but I'm really, this is a topic that I feel really excited about and very passionate about. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about climate change in shipping and to offer some thoughts on my what I've learned about climate change policy and law, and how you can bring about effective transitions in sectors which have got high emissions. And I think as I've been getting to know the shipping sector, I've become increasingly aware of the absolute central importance of shipping to the global economy. The fact that 90% of world trade is shipped is a hugely important statistic, and shows that as we think about how we can continue to have the global economy growing and prosperity growing, we also need to think about how we will decarbonise these essential sectors. Now, I've been, I think, like many people, the signing of the Paris Agreement 2015 really marked a watershed in our efforts to tackle climate change. At the moment, obviously, we see greenhouse gas emissions, the concentrations of greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere continuing to climb, but it does seem likely or possible now that we will be seeing the contribution of emissions declining, or at least plateauing, as we move to decarbonise how we generate electricity. That's the single biggest source of greenhouse gases, and for the longest time has been dominated by fossil fuel consumption and fossil fuel burning, particularly coal. And we're seeing now, with a number of policies applying in different countries around the world, the turning of that corner, so that we're seeing emissions in that sector starting to fall. But there are obviously many other sectors where we still need to take action, and the Paris Agreement itself doesn't, as you know, cover two very important sectors of aviation and shipping. But the shipping sector clearly has the potential to bring about its own version of the Paris Agreement, or its own set of sector-specific policies that can mean that it's making its contribution to solving this global problem. And I think even though we might look around the world, and certainly in the US we've seen a slight backward step with possible withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, there are still really strong reasons to be hopeful, not least because the effect of the last 20 years of policy making and support for alternative technologies and emissions reduction technologies has meant that costs are coming down. And that's having a big effect. If we can see technologies come to market without the need for large subsidies, then that makes the job of reducing emissions that bit easier. But that's not come around by accident. It's been a function of policymakers and lawmakers bringing laws to pass that have created incentives to bring new technologies in and to price the pollution that otherwise we freely allow to be emitted into the atmosphere. And I just wanted to offer some thoughts on the what makes for successful climate change policy, and perhaps in the context of shipping, this is really important as the IMO is currently discussing and seeking to agree a strategy for addressing climate change. One of the things I learned when working on the Climate Change Act was that you could set a challenging and ambitious trajectory, but if there wasn't any confidence that outcome could be reached, you'd get real resistance to supporting that policy. And there was always a balance between ambition and flexibility. And the way we got to a solution in the Climate Change Act was to create a framework based around carbon budgets that allowed us to be ambitious in where the end point was, and the 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 was the end goal. But we created a system of carbon budgets that enabled a flexible pathway to that goal. We also, I think this is very important, created an expert committee on climate change to advise the government on where those budgets should be set. That legal framework, I think, has stood the test of time in the UK, and it's now we're setting up the 5th carbon budget, means that we are continuing on our path of decarbonisation in the UK. And what's exciting, I think, for the shipping sector now is that you are at the point of being able to craft and draft your own version of a climate change act for shipping. And I think as we look around the world, we have 20 years or so of policy experience to draw from. There are 1,200 laws that have been passed to tackle climate change in over 160 countries. And from those policies, you can really work out which ones work and which ones can be applied and can drive change in the shipping sector. So I think it's an exciting time. I'm really delighted to be getting involved in this sector and to learning all about it. It's truly fascinating. And I think you're starting out with the benefit of many lessons from other sectors. You can draw from the best from that and apply it to the sector. And if you get the combination of the legal framework that creates incentives right, then you'll be able to look back in a couple of decades from now and see a sector transformed. And I think that's the really exciting challenge. We know that technologies are out there, some of which are ready to go, some of which will need further R&D, but we can get going on those technologies we know today if we introduce clever policy design that incentivizes the deployment of what we know works. Then anything's possible, and I'm looking forward to engaging with this through the IMO and through conversation with industry over the coming months. And I really wish you a great and successful conference. And I look forward to interacting with you in person when I'm next able to visit this conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Bryony, who's possibly on an aeroplane at this minute, so she won't hear that. But so that's a very general introduction and quite an upbeat message from a lawmaker there. Magna, do you also hold optimistic views that shipping is going to do enough to... Okay.
That I am an optimist by nature, so if anybody has, then I'm confirming I'm an optimist. Actually, yes, I do. It has changed a bit because shipping has been a little bit reluctant a couple of years ago to embark on that discussion. And the same is actually true, or even more true, with a number of governments that are important in the shipping world. I mean, here, big flag states. And I'm not looking here in particular at the EU, I'm looking more outside the EU. But I think with various developments at IMO level, starting with the EEDI, which has been really the first regulatory framework to improve a sector in terms of the energy efficiency and performance, and to make sure that whatever new is being built in the shipping world is continuously being improved. I read it as a clear indication and commitment that yes, also in maritime transport there's a will to take climate change challenges seriously. Paris Agreement clearly helped, and that set a completely new tune in discussion, also with partners worldwide, also with countries like China, as to how we address climate change with regard to maritime transport. And the discussions that will take place in London in the week starting 23rd of October must not be underestimated. That's the second intersessional meeting of IMO to look at preparing the initial strategy to be agreed upon in April. There's very, very high level of expectations towards the outcomes of those discussions in 2 weeks' time. Let me take this opportunity to officially, I'm not doing it for the first time, but I like to do it every now and again, to officially acknowledge and applaud the shipping sector, that with the submission by ICS for July MEPC really set a tone for the discussion in IMO. What I found amazing in July when first the intersessional and MEPC discussions happened was that at the end of the MEPC week, both the shipping industry and the green NGOs were equally frustrated with the slow pace of progress. And I think it's almost a historic moment when I heard exactly the same criticism coming from the two sides, which more often than not sort of argue a little bit as to how to deal with climate change and environmental aspect. I very much hope that what we will get at the end of October, or at the end of the intersessional, will be an agreement on the vision, will be the agreement on what need to be the elements of the strategy agreed in April, what could be the list of measures, short, medium and long-term measures, and even if not everything is written down to the last letter now in October, I am actually convinced that between October and April we will manage to have a broad understanding what this strategy should look like. There is also COP23 in the meantime in Bonn. We'll be having a discussion between the industry and the green NGOs that I volunteered to moderate just for the kick of it. I'm actually I see the shipping industry being quite constructive in these discussions. It's not yet, we are not there yet. Maybe I'm a bit too optimistic, but I'm happy to hear from Espen and Panos what they will say to that. It's not going to be an easy discussion because, of course, there are a lot of question marks. And I think one of the difficult elements is that we are really looking many years ahead. We are trying to write a strategy that will be sufficiently solid to stay in place over the next, let's say, 50 years. A strategy that stays for 50 years is a miracle of its own. And maybe just final comment, you will hear me saying we here, referring predominantly to the IMO. It is not to say the Commission doesn't have a voice in the IMO, but I'm doing that so that everybody is absolutely clear. We are in favor of a global solution. We believe that for shipping, a global solution at IMO level is the preferred one. But this solution has to be, and we heard it from Baroness Worthington, it has to be ambitious and realistic at the same time. And I think this is going to be the biggest challenge and the biggest nut to crack before whatever, 8th of April or whenever we meet for the MEPC 72.
But, you believe in a global solution, but a European one if the industry is foot dragging.
I think it's not so straightforward. When we put the European MRV on the table, and let me again say, MRV is not an end in itself. MRV is a tool to prepare to know what we do and how we work and what is needed and what is the situation with regards to emissions. So MRV is not there to be just as a self-standing instrument. MRV is to help to come up with a strategy. But when we put the European MRV on the table, the tone of discussions in the IMO environment was slightly different. And I will risk the statement that putting European MRV on the table did help to maybe make the discussions at the IMO level a bit more conclusive. There is a clause in there's a statement in the European regulation that when IMO comes up with its own, with a global solution, we will revise and review the European one. Public consultations are now out until the 1st of December this year, in order for us to prepare a proposal that will take into account the fact that we have a global solution agreed upon by IMO. But I said it before, and I know I need to finish, but I have to say that European regulation is a political process, and even if the Commission puts on the table whatever proposal we want to put on the table, we still have to account for those who may want to change it. And I think a solid and convincing strategy in April, agreed by IMO, is the best guarantee that we will not have a European solution. And I remain silent for the rest of the panel.
I'm only thinking about your aircraft, but thank you, Magda. That was very interesting. We're running out of time. I've still got to do some very quick votation, have I?
You don't have to, I think. You
Okay, I don't have to.
Perhaps we can do them if we have time later.
We can do that later. Right, we've got 5 minutes. Esbjørn.
Responding to some of the points Magda made, MRV, I think I'll just leave aside and focus more on the fact that I think Magda is right that we may have been a little slow off the mark going back a few years, but I think our industry is a very responsible and very, in my opinion, successful industry, very adaptable, ready to change, and ready to understand its role in this important issue of climate change. We were not part of Paris, as has already been pointed out, but we are doing everything we can to live within the spirit of Paris, and we're taking concrete steps. And you mentioned the MEPC meeting in July. We've subsequently done a roundtable agreement with BIMCO, Intercargo, and Intertanko, and ourselves for further submission. And we work very closely with the IMO at all levels, and I'm very, very optimistic that we will make a lot of progress. This upcoming meeting at the end of October indeed is very important, as is the roadmap to be agreed in April of next year. But on all these fronts, we have already reduced CO2 emissions. I don't want to sound like a politician here, but we have, through EEDI, done things that are concrete and that have reduced CO2 emissions. And I believe that the ingenuity of mankind is such that we will find new fuels that will be fossil-free and efficient sooner than we all can imagine at this moment. And in the meanwhile, the industry has a strong incentive in reducing CO2 emissions because fuel is the biggest single cost in operating a ship. So I think it's these things are self-evident, but there's a lot of optimism around, and the dialogue we're having with IMO at every level, including Secretary General, who I met with several times, is extremely positive, and I am indeed, on behalf of the industry, very hopeful.
Leo, do you want to make a comment?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm amazed that no one from the shipping side actually said the obvious thing, that shipping is one of the industries that cannot decarbonize as easily as others can do. I'm amazed that no one says that. How can you transport 150,000 tons using a non-hydrocarbon fuel? The shipping industry used wind power and abandoned it as soon as a better fuel came along, a much more efficient one, because of the unreliability of wind power. So, I mean, how are we going to go back to anything like that unless a new fuel is invented? I just cannot believe this. So, and the Commission to even talk about it like that, and the industry, please enlighten me as to how it's going to be done. The decarbonization, you said, in the United Kingdom, where I live, the Climate Change Act that Baroness Worthington apparently was involved with, has been called the longest suicide note ever in the United Kingdom, which will decarbonize the UK economy. So it's unbelievable. And the United States, one reason why they're powering away again is because of shale oil and gas, especially gas. So I'm really sorry to have made this intervention, but I felt I had to do it.
It was very useful. It's been very useful because this helps me to introduce some bits of the proceedings of this afternoon, when an historian, Biagio Prasso, will entertain us on the glory of the Marineria Sorrentina, the Sorrento shipping that Mario and I know quite well, in the 19th century and 18th century, when we used the wind at that time. Yes. Obviously, we're not 150,000 tons, but the cargo was a little lighter than that.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Mario, do you want to make a quick comment? I'm aware we've got 1.5 minutes.
Very quick one. I was hoping to be solved by Francesco, and he brought me out of the stage, but I'm here, so I have to say. I think that shipping, as has been said, sorry, I missed some of the speech and some of the part of the discussion. But in any case, I think that shipping is one of the industry that, by definition, is the one that pollutes less per unit ton transported. So I think that because we need transportation all over the world, the goods needs to be transported. By the way, it is the less polluting in terms. Shipping has two parts. One is the sea transportation, when the ships move from one point to another, and of course, in that side, I think that there is a problem of emission, but is not a big problem. And the second one, that is the concentration of the emissions when a ship is in port. So that's the main issue, especially, I mean, today you were saying about the port of Naples is exactly in the center of the town, in the middle of town. And of course, if you have a concentration of ships over there that are staying there for one day and they have to take on their generator and so on, of course there is a concentration of pollution in an area. So I think that we have to look at two things. I know that we are working very much on the cold ironing or on the use of alternative fuels when the ship is in port. Definitely now the ship has to maneuver with low content of sulfur and so on. But I think these are the two parts, and we need to create a strong infrastructure within the ports in order to avoid that when a ship is there, and a ship is there and has to be there to discharge its cargo, its passengers and so on, pollutes less. I think that we have solved 90% of the problem of the shipping.
Panos, 1 minute only.
I broadly agree with what has been said. I've tried to listen very carefully to the speech of the Baroness, but she being a politician, I almost didn't understand anything. The situation is rather simple. The shipping industry understands its responsibility despite the fact that we are not included in the Paris Agreement, despite the fact that we are the most efficient mode of transport, despite all these things, but we do realize that we have to contribute to this important problem. How do we contribute? We contribute in a fair, proportionate, and equitable way. This is the European policy declared, and although you hear many other people coming out and speaking about this indiscriminately left, right, and center, this is the basic policy. We understand the problem, we understand we must contribute, but we will contribute in a fair and proportional way in proportion to the pollution we are creating, no more and no less. There are three ways the problem can be solved. The first problem is technological progress. You will perhaps not be surprised that most about technological problem is spoken by people who don't understand anything about technology. They have no idea about engineering, and they think there is a magical way which in 5-10 years will decarbonize the industry. This is not going to happen. The dream about new fuels, electric power is not going to bring us anywhere, especially for the blue water, big, large vessels fleet. Hydrogen is ages away. The only practical fuel which can be used, we simply cannot even talk about it, which is nuclear power, so this is out. Therefore, there can be only very, very small improvements from the technological point of view, very small improvements. This is the first way of decarbonizing. The second way of decarbonizing is simply saying you will pay. Well, if governments or regulators tell us we have to pay, then we will have to pay. But this is not the proper or most efficient way to do it. And the third way is to decarbonize or reduce the impact of the carbon way of operating in shipping by operational measures. Now, what does that mean? It means more efficient use of ships, more efficient use of ports, but most importantly, the only thing that would bring a real sea of change was to regulate slower speeds. Okay. You regulate slower speeds, whoever wants to go faster has to pay. That's all.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to close this part of the conference now. Thank you very, very much for your attention and listening to this debate, which I think is extremely interesting, stimulating, and important. I just feel obliged to come to the defense of Baroness Worthington, as she's not here to defend herself. The politicians are not worth listening to. I think where we started was talking about a potential global political and economic crisis and a crisis around capitalism. Part of this is because of a feeling that many people have that they're not being listened to, and politicians are democratically elected, not in Baroness Worthington's case actually, but generally democratically elected. They represent the people and their voice must be heard. Anyway, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it myself. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. And we'll have a quick coffee break and then we'll move on to David Ostler, who's going to moderate a particular issue around Brexit and Donald Trump and protectionism. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also, decarbonising cannot be done in shipping.
I would like to thank Terry and all the very distinguished speaker. You moderately a very interesting debate. I think we are in a theater, so it's a very highly rated performance. It's not yet Shakespeare, but I mean, we are working on it for the next years. And so I hope to have you and all the other panelists back next year at Shipping and the Law. Mrs. Kopinska has to leave in a minute, but she must have a coffee and a photograph with me before leaving. And I think we will cut short the coffee break from half an hour to less than 15 minutes, so we'll regain some of the time. And I would like to thank also Caronte tourists who are offering this coffee and many other things during these proceedings, thanks to the generosity of Lorenzo, Matacena, and Caronte. Thank you.